We're going to have one more keynote address, and that is from Steve Ritter, who is the co-founder and chief scientist at Carnegie Learning, which is a large group now. He will present a talk on large-scale commercialization.
I'm going to talk about large-scale commercialization, or what I know of it, based on our experience at Carnegie Learning. As Bev said, I'm a co-founder and chief scientist at Carnegie Learning. For people who don't know about Carnegie Learning, we started at Carnegie Mellon University. We've been in business for 22 years or so. And based on more than 30 years, probably up that number even, of learning science research. And we really take our focus to be applying learning science to education in schools. We're probably best known for our Intelligent Tutoring System, which used to be called Cognitive Tutor, is now called Mathia. Mathia is not often delivered as a product on its own. It's usually implemented as part of a blended core mathematics curriculum. And by blended, I mean a curriculum that includes both text and software. And by core, I mean that the curriculum is intended to be the primary instructional resource. And so essentially in the US, certainly, most courses in middle and high school have a textbook. They're structured around the materials provided in the textbook, and we're an alternative kind of textbook. You can think of 6 middle and high school math courses, 3 middle school grades, and then in the US, it's typically Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2. Sometimes there are differences in the way those work. And we provide those courses. And part of the theme of this talk is going to be how much stuff we do that doesn't get into papers, but are really essential for succeeding in the commercial world, for getting usage by schools. In addition to this text and software, one of those things is what I'm calling teacher or administrator support. Usually we call this professional learning or professional development. We deliver an enormous number of courses for teachers and administrators who want to implement our curricula, but also we deliver courses that are on basic mathematics, for example, for elementary teachers who are not necessarily going to use any of our courses, but to kind of give them a deeper knowledge of the mathematics so they know where the elementary's math is leading. And then we also do in-classroom support, where we'll have people go into classrooms, observe the teachers, provide them feedback, in some cases co-teach. So a lot of support on implementation, because most of what we do is changing the way mathematics is taught. And I'll talk about that as well. State-specific courses, another thing it's really important that we don't really talk about, but in the United States, there's 50 different states. They have 50 different sets of state standards. Your courses need to be exactly aligned with the state standards for each state, or else you're not going to kind of make any headway in that state. And we're at about a little over 600,000 students per year in our math curricula. We also have products in English language arts, world languages, computer science, and a couple other subjects that I won't talk too much about. And I will actually, although I've mentioned the text and professional development, I'm mostly going to focus on Mathia, which is our intelligent tutoring system. This is kind of a quick view of Mathia. On the left is a word problem, a type of exercise that students might do in Mathia. They're going to set up a proportion to represent the problem. Each of the steps in setting up this proportion, so there are 8 quantities, 4 numbers, and 4 units of measure that go along with those numbers. Each of those steps is monitored by our intelligent tutoring system. Students receive immediate feedback on how they are doing on each of those individual steps. The software allows them to go through the problems in different ways to implement their own strategies. So one strategy in this kind of problem is to fill in the units of measure first, which keeps it makes it easier to get the numeric ratios in the right order when you have the units of measure. And then on the right, showing what we call our skillometer. These are skills, or sometimes called knowledge components, which underlie the problems in this domain. So every ratio, this is sort of covering all the bits of knowledge that students need to learn in order to solve ratio problems of this type. And in general, it's a mastery-based system. So what students are trying to do is get these circles to fill up and turn green. When all the circles turn green, they've shown mastery of this particular topic, and they go on to the next topic in the software. So it's mastery-based and self-paced in that way. And to give you a sense of, it differs depending on the course and the state standards, but typically there's between 60 and 100 what we call workspaces or units of mastery that students will go through. And in order to master each of those units, they'll do somewhere between 3 and 25 problems of that type to master these skills. So there's quite a bit of active learning going on. So how do we get here? How did we get to the point where we're reasonably widespread in schools? As I said, 600,000 students a year, over 3,000 schools. And I think the key is thinking about how you fit into the school environment. And I'm going to illustrate that with respect to thinking about personalization, which is one of the things that AI systems are particularly good at and particularly focused on. And you can talk about different kinds of personalization. Progression through the curriculum is probably the most common. Competency-based progression is a more general term for what I'm calling mastery learning, but there are other ways to progress students through the curriculum. Activity selection is another component to that, selecting appropriate topics for students within that progression, and then content responding to students' interests, preferences, those kinds of things. And in terms of fit in the schools, one of the things that it probably took me an amazingly long time to really realize is that mastery learning is not a great fit for the way schools work. Schools are organized around the idea that students learn at the same pace, even though probably everyone believes that students don't learn at the same pace. But typical classes in schools are teacher driven. That is, the teacher in a traditional textbook class, for example, outlines the set of activities or lessons that they're going to do day to day. Those lessons might sort of respond to the overall class's ability and speed at which they're learning. But mostly the teacher's goal is to cover the curriculum in the school year before the final test. And the fact that there's a final test constrains what the teacher does, right? The teacher feels like her job, or many teachers feel like their job, is to present all the material that's going to be on the test, as opposed to thinking about what the students learn of the material that's going to be on the test. And so fundamentally, mastery learning or any kind of competency-based progression, if it's at the student level, it's going to be student-paced. So you can see the blue line here, and this is each of these dots represents a classroom in a large district. You can see over a school year, students who are self-paced, who are allowed to move at their own pace, like the design of Mathia intends, have a roughly constant error rate every week. That's exactly what you want, because as students master things, we're introducing new topics on which they're going to make errors. So having a constant error rate means we're giving students a roughly constant rate of challenge every day. The red line are classes where teachers do have the ability to move students ahead, to essentially try and match students' pace in the software to the pace that the teacher is setting in the classroom. And there you see that the error rate goes up as the school year goes on. That's because new knowledge builds on old knowledge. Math is cumulative, and so you start to see students by the end of the year who are missing a lot of prerequisites because the teacher keeps moving them along to meet the teacher's pace, rather than allowing students to go at their own pace. And this kind of goes along with another discovery that took us way too long to think about is there's a smart AI model that we had for Mathia and Cognitive Tutor, which is essentially a remediate on failure model. So the idea is the student works with the software. When the student fails or reaches an impasse, then they call over the teacher and the teacher helps out. And we've gone away from that model in a way that I'll talk about here, which is more of an integration model. And the idea is, instead of thinking of the software as kind of being primary and calling in the teacher when the software, I should say, when the student fails, it's really when the software fails, if the software doesn't connect with the student. What we're trying to think about is the software and the teacher as being components of a complete educational system. And so we're trying to appropriately use each of those resources. And in particular, the real scarce resource is the teacher. And so we're trying to optimize that teacher's time. And it turns out, so we did a study where students had access. This was to an online tutor, but we take that online tutor access to be a proxy for the same kinds of things that is going on in physical classrooms and the teacher is there. And this is just evidence that teacher attention is poorly allocated. These were students using Mathia. They had unlimited and free access to online tutoring. 80% of students never used it. We have good evidence that they should have used it at least sometimes. And then 1% of our students used 42% of the tutoring time that was allocated. And so that teacher's attention, if you think about what the teacher's attention, the teacher being the scarce resource, that resource is being poorly allocated to students. Another thing that we discovered in this work is what we call, think about the role of the teacher, information versus affirmation. Information is tutoring, how do I do this particular part of math? But a lot of the dialogues with the tutors were not the student really asking for information. It's really the student explaining how they got to the answer and then asking the tutor, did I get it right? So really, if you read this dialogue, the tutor doesn't teach anything. The tutor just says, yes, yes, go on, that's great. And the student says, I was hoping I did this right. So thinking about the role for the teacher in a world of AI is thinking about that. So this general idea of acting as a system led us to thinking about what comes under teacher orchestration systems. We have a dashboard that you see on the right here called Live Lab. And what we've done is built some detectors that focus on the student's progression to mastery on all those underlying skills, the things that you saw previously as dials. And we built a detector that detects when students are on the path to non-mastery, what's labeled unproductive struggle in this graph. And that's really the key for where we want teachers to intervene. If the students are making errors, but productively learning from their errors, moving towards mastery, then maybe we don't want to intervene. It's only in this unproductive struggle. And so that's what we're trying to detect. And that's a good example of how to utilize the teacher, have the AI call the teacher in when appropriate. And so this is what it looks like. Again, the student working with the teacher. One part that we haven't quite figured out here is the round trip. How does the teacher tell the software that the student has been helped? And we do have a button like that. It's not used to the extent that we'd like to see it used. So there may be some better ways that we can kind of understand when the teacher helped the student. But what I would be most excited about on this is that if we knew that we signaled the teacher to help a student, the teacher actually helped the student. And then we also saw that the student now returned to that mastery path. We could then reinforce what the teacher was doing. So give the teacher some praise for having put the student back on the path to learning. So that's kind of the holy grail for me that we haven't quite worked out yet. And communication in this way with teachers is really key. So one of the things that I think has helped us be successful is to take all this AI, so all the knowledge components and things that we talk about in the literature and the Bayesian knowledge tracing and all the techniques we do. We don't talk to teachers and administrators about that. They're not interested. What they want to know is a simple model for how they can train their teachers and monitor kind of the system. And this is one form of a simple model that we give teachers. And it seems like overly simplistic, maybe from an academic standpoint, but it's very successful in the school district because they need to kind of communicate this well. The first is setting an expectation that learning takes time. So it's fine to say students can go at their own pace, but teachers do want students to learn the material required in the class by the end of the year. And what that means is they may need to figure out how to give some students more time, the time that they need to learn, right? And also in general, to allocate the instructional time to things that are instructional. Lots of things interfere with instructional time. Second part, which they're very aware of, is you can't just monitor time, you have to monitor productivity during that time. We have a couple of papers that talk about this kind of issue, that when we, at one point, we emphasized, students should put 50 hours into Mathia over the course of a school year, which is true. But what we found was in some schools, students were doing 3 times as much work in those 50 hours as in other schools. And so teachers need to understand that students need to get to work. And then the last one is instructional support. And from the beginning, over 20 years ago, we always told teachers that they had a role. They shouldn't just sit back and, check Facebook while their students are using Mathia. They have an instructional role while students are using the software. But until we introduced Live Lab, until we made that role really evident to teachers and showed teachers who was struggling and who they should go help, that message didn't get through very well. And so the instructional support message is particularly important for helping teachers understand implementations. All this goes along with extensive reporting. Someone recently asked me about, what papers we had on our reporting systems, and it turns out I think the answer is none. But in fact, the reports that we provide to teachers, you can think of Live Lab as a kind of report, but most of our reports are for planning purposes. They can give teachers lots of detailed information about whether students mastered a particular topic or not, what they did on the road to mastery, how long they took, what skills they mastered, what skills they didn't master, all those kinds of things. And finally, I'll talk, since we talked a little bit, I know Danielle and others were talking about Shoot the other day, talking about self-assessment. One of the things that we've been doing is building models that correlate student activities within Mathia to their performance on end-of-year test scores. And so the graph on the left is that kind of correlation. We built a model. We summarized that model in a metric that we call applause, adaptive personalized learning score. And we show that students who receive higher applause levels score higher on standardized tests. And that's true even when controlling for their pre-test performance, their ability in going into that class. So we know that Mathia is giving a value add on top of that. But again, this is too abstract for teachers to understand. We translate that kind of correlation into what we call a progress monitoring system, a progress monitoring report, which allows teachers to track day to day, week to week, whether individual students and whether classes and schools are on track for their end of year assessments. And if not, that simple model of, is it time, is it productivity, or is it instructional support that's accounting for them not meeting their course goals. Okay, so that's a whirlwind tour.
Okay, cool. So I think that's great. Impressive results, really. Any questions from anyone? I wanted to ask, I see that you sort of don't give direct results or dashboard to the teacher. What you're saying is that you give them something else.
Well,
They don't actually see.
it depends what you mean by direct results, I suppose, right?
Yeah.
So I didn't show you all the reports that we have. We don't have a way to show teachers like the students' actual work, in part because well, students are doing a lot of work, and so there's a lot there. But I don't think that's actually an intention. I think it's more one of those things that we just either haven't gotten to, or there are technological limitations. If that's, to be able to kind of review exactly what an individual student did.
So we have raised hands. Let me just see. Do you see the questions are from Peter and Alexander? So Alexander hasn't asked before. Why don't you go ahead, Alexander?
Oh, but Peter was first on the hand. Well, I'll just add. It was maybe a decade or so ago. I was working with Reasoning Mind when they were starting to figure out teacher role versus student role. I'm wondering how the role of the teacher changed. Could you just tell me how a typical middle school or high school class goes, what the teacher's doing during different points?
Yeah, so our normative model, and I'll ignore all the pandemic variations, but our normative model is that students use Mathia 2 days a week in their regular math class. The other 3 days a week, they're doing activities from our textbook. The textbook activities are much more open-ended. The textbook is actually, we call it a math book. It's a workbook. They write in the book. They're active problems. They typically do them in small groups and share results and strategies with the class. In the software, students are working independently during those 2 days a week. And the teacher's role is to assist the students when they need that help. And again, we're trying to change that model from the student raising their hand to call the teacher over, where, as you saw on that graph, like by analogy, 80% of students will never raise their hand, and a small group of students will monopolize the teacher's time. So we're trying with LiveLab to give teachers signals to direct them to students who need help. And then I didn't talk. Yeah.
Go ahead. Did you find that you can change teacher attention so that it's better?
So we haven't done a formal study of that, but definitely anecdotally, we've heard a lot, again, like from teachers who have changed their attitudes towards what their role is while students are using the software, because we're able to show them. So the first thing, it's not worth going back to the screenshot or anything, but it shows the teacher that students are struggling, right? It's very easy for the teacher to kind of sit back and say, well, nobody has their hand raised, so I guess everything's fine, right? And we're able to kind of show them, no, there's a student who needs your help right now.
Got it.
Go help that student.
Okay, and then Peter has a question, and then Louis.
Just interesting to see some publication about that. Stephen, you've been actively citing your work when you start talking about the principles, but then you get to some really important things. How get it all working? And you stop citing publication. That means you're not really publishing all that. It's like, it's not AI very much, right? Nobody will publish it. That's the key, right?
I don't know if they'll publish it or not, but yeah, you're right. Like a lot of the things that we do, that we need to do to be successful, are not, not groundbreaking or anything. It's, like understanding that you need to correlate your curriculum to state standards and provide a way for teachers to do that. I don't know. There's actually some interesting, complex challenges in that area, but yeah, it's not anything that we've published about.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah, I'm glad that we have this workshop that we can share these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And Louis Johnson.
Yeah, I'm just curious, Steve, about, so you said Mathia is used in class, but you didn't say that it's used for homework. And I just wonder, what's your thought about the role of a Mathia-like tool as a homework activity?
Yeah, it's interesting. So it's definitely, it's web-based. It can be used as homework in some schools and districts. It is used heavily for homework, and others it isn't. We like last week got a request from one of our field people who's supporting a school district asking if there was any way to lock Mathia in
Peter, this, Steve, there's a problem here.
Sorry, I got, yeah.
Got it.
I'm muted.
Okay, yeah.
All right. So I don't know. So we got a request from a teacher asking if she could lock students out of Mathia in the evening because she didn't want them. Now, I don't really know the story behind that. It's probably, I don't know exactly why, but I do know that there are definitely districts that worry about equity issues, for example, and don't want to give certain students an advantage because they have computers at home and they can complete more at home and things like that. So it's very much up to it's up to the teacher and administration and the school district to decide how much they're emphasizing use of Mathia. We don't actually have a way to lock it out, so it is available to students. My recommendation actually was there is a report you could tell. You could look in the morning, like who used it last night. If you want to punish them for that, okay. But yeah,
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, Robbie has a question, and then Garon.
Yes, Steve, in Lewis's talk earlier, I don't know if you saw it, but he was pointing out that whereas the ed tech market is ginormous, the part that uses the educational market and the technology market, the part that uses AI is really small. So
yeah.
Do you have thoughts? I mean, 600,000 students is a lot, congratulations. But if you want to get that to 6 million,
yeah,
or what
we
is
do, we do.
Yeah, I imagine. So what are the obstacles, and how can this help in some sense? What is it that we need to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. The truth is, if I really knew the answer, we'd be at 6 million by now. Except that it's hard to get from here to there. And I do think the kind of negative view on the theme is that what AI is going to require is schools to do their business differently to really be widespread. So when I talk about personalization and student self-pacing, and that particularly that last part, so here's the real dream for that correlation, that applause correlation, where we can predict the end of your test, the stealth assessment that we're doing. So we can correlate with end of year test based on what students do in Mathia. Well, what that should mean is you shouldn't have to take that end of year test because you've already taken it. That's the idea of a self-assessment. But also what that means is if a student's able to complete their 7th grade math requirements in February, they should be able to move on to 8th grade math, right? But the school system right now, for accelerating in that way, or accommodating students who need more than a school year, doesn't fit into the school model. They don't have, that's a problem for them if a student finishes the course in February. The teacher needs to figure out now, what do I do with that kid? Right? Absolutely. And so they invent things. I mean, some teachers do it really well and stuff, but in general, they don't consider that to be something to be celebrated. They consider that to be kind of be a hassle, right? So what needs to happen is the school's structure and expectations need to change to match a truly personalized model. Another example, I didn't talk about content personalization, but if you want students to be interested in math, you ought to be able to give them activities that they're interested in doing that are mathematical, right? Which just means there's more than one way to teach proportional reasoning, right? Mm-hmm. And you ought to be able to give different students different content and different ways of learning that proportional reasoning, and yet somehow signal to the system that the students have reached an equivalent level of knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. And that, the whole idea of a standardized test having the exact same items for every student is mostly about accommodating, parents and school administrators and other people who kind of don't, the only way they will trust the test, that the test is fair, is that everybody there's a lot of opposition to even adaptive testing, right? Because what if I get a set of hard questions and the other kid got easier questions? So the notion of being able to personalize yet also provide accountability is a really difficult challenge that has something to do with AI, but more to do with school systems and how we think about what the work of schools is.
Okay. Louis still has a question?
Oh, I still do.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I keep thinking of questions.
No, that's perfect.
So, there's a lot of concern these days about learning loss in math. And I'm curious whether you guys are focusing as a business now and trying to address that problem, and if so, how?
Yeah, so today is NAEP Day, right? They released the results of the NAEP today, if you weren't aware. So you'll see a lot of
and it's terrible.
You'll see a lot of you'll see a lot of depressing news articles and all that stuff. So yeah, that's definitely something that we're concerned with. I'll say along the line, and by the way, the pandemic makes a lot of things more evident, but there are big issues always. And part of what I think one thing that AI systems can focus on is treating things more like an optimization problem. So so what we do in Mathia is we take grade level content and we try and give students the best experience within that grade level content so they can satisfy the grade level standards. But there's this very difficult issue about what to do with out of grade level standards, pre-grade level standards. You're in 7th grade and you haven't mastered all the 6th grade knowledge that you need to build on. But there's no extra time in the 7th grade school day to accommodate 6th grade. So one model of people I know is RTI, really stupid acronym that means response to intervention. And MTSS, it also goes under a name MTSS, which is multi-tiered systems of supports. Anyway, they're mostly equivalent, but the idea there is you give this diagnostic test at the beginning of the year, and students who are enough below grade level that they need additional instruction get essentially a second math class. It might be 5 days a week, it might be less. So they're kind of learning their prerequisites in parallel. They don't take them out of their regular grade level math class because they're still responsible for grade level content. If that doesn't sound like a crazy system to you, it is. And it's crazy for all sorts of reasons that you might not have quite internalized, but among them are like first day of school or first week of school, you're taking this enormous boring test. You don't your knowledge is being underassessed, and the consequences are you get to sit in a second math class all year, which is going to turn you off to math even more.
Absolutely.
And so there's an alternative model that we've been working on. It's not just us, but others have been talking about this kind of acceleration model, which is the idea that let's stay on grade level content and fill in when we see the gaps. So essentially, as you're working through 7th grade material, we detect just in time the gaps in your knowledge that are attributable, let's say, to 6th grade, things you didn't learn well in 6th grade, and fill in right there. And there's a lot of advantages to that, at least we think so, because you will fill in some of those gaps by yourself, because some of those things are things you learned, but you just forgot or didn't recognize on the test because it's the first test you've taken in 3 years because you had a pandemic and things like that. So, so I think it's easier to fill in than it is to try and remediate everything. And that's actually a really, I think, fruitful direction for AI is detecting those gaps and learning how to efficiently fill them.
That sounds like a huge role for AI and exactly what it should be doing.
Yeah.
So Garon has a question, and Ben again.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Steve, for the talk. I really enjoyed your presentation. My name is Garon Hilaire. I'm at Erdiff, a newer organization that started about 8 months ago officially. But one of the questions what came up in your talk just recently was around issues of equity with students may or may not having computers at home in terms of homework assignments with adaptive systems. And I just felt like that was a comment that came through in passing. And I believe that that's like a tip of an iceberg for you, Steve. And I'd love to hear you tell us, like, from your perspective, what are sort of like the top 1 or 2, maybe even 3 if you got the time, equity issues related to AI in education as you see it from the vantage point of having an implementation at that scale?
Yeah. So one potentially positive impact of the pandemic was that access to devices is much more common than it was before. But you'll also see, like, the pandemic magnified the existing inequities. So that absolutely wasn't it didn't reduce the inequities, just providing the hardware. I think there are huge differences in preparation of teachers across school districts, and in ability to support students. So I think a lot of it is about, it's not that AI has a role to play in helping both potentially educate teachers, but also support teachers, like in the way that I was talking about. So let me give you like one thing. If this were an hour talk, I have a lot of really cool things to talk about. But like when we talk about like remediating content just in time, when we look at the detectors that are signaling teachers to go help students, one of the things that's really interesting is to look into the kinds of things that they're signaling. And one of the one pretty common mode is what I call a failure of transfer, not a real learning gap. So it's something that students, we've seen that students know how to do in one context, but they don't seem to know how to apply it in another context. So one particular example is we taught students about inequalities on a number line. So symbol, saying X is greater than 3 and less than 12, right? And so they do graphing on a number line like that. And then later, we're teaching them about functions and talking about the domain of a function and asking them to express or represent the domain of a function as an inequality. And they can't do it when they're looking at the graph of the function. And, well, actually, most students can do it. There's a small group of students who don't make that transfer, and it's because they don't realize that the axes of a graph are number lines. No one ever said that. And that's sort of like a deep like understanding of what's going on in the graph in some ways, right? But it's totally like not the kind of thing that we teach. But you could imagine a system being smart enough to understand that if you see that detector, maybe this is the remediation that the student needs. And it's not, I don't think it's very hard or would take a whole lot of time to tell a student, hey, you remember what you learned about the number line? Think of the axis as a number line, because it is. Right?
Great. Let's have our last question from Ben now for Steve.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve. That was really interesting. I particularly like the way that you have really focused on the complicated ecology that changes over time in the classroom, where you've got different kinds of resources. You've got math here and you've got textbooks. You've got different kinds of agents. You've got math here and you've got the teacher. And the question I want to ask is that one of the primary jobs of the teacher is actually to persuade the kids to put some energy into the learning of mathematics, and as opposed to fixing problems that bits they can't understand. And in your experience, have you found that task of the teacher how is that affected by the fact that you've got math here in there? Does it make it easier? Does it make it harder? I mean, I'm not quite sure which way that goes.
That's a really good question, and we certainly don't have any kind of formal data on that. My sense is that that's something that we honestly have not done all that well within Mathia. So Mathia itself could promote this feeling that math is important and valuable and interesting, but I think most of that does come from the teacher. Like that, you saw a little bit of that affirmation dialogue where the tutor isn't doing anything. And in fact, the student had already gone through Mathia. So the student knew that Mathia thought whatever he did was correct. right? But having a human connection where somebody else tells you, yes, you're thinking about it correctly, is somehow different than having a computer tell you that. And so that's one area where maybe somebody else will figure it out, but I'm not hugely optimistic that that's a role for AI, right? It's a role for AI to recognize, like, I'd love to be able to tell the teacher, hey, this student, like, you should talk to this student about, you know, how the interesting things in math, right? So like, I was a student who kind of liked some of the abstract elements of it. Like, we often think like, oh, interest is about talking about math in your real life. And I was like, when somebody told me there was a fourth dimension and you could do math about the fourth dimension, I was like, wow, that's cool. You know, so for me, you know, talking about how math is used in a business context might not have been as interesting as, you know, fourth dimension or Mobius strips or weird stuff like that. So
thank you very much, Steve. This is really insightful. And I like the fact that you're at 600,000 students. I can wait.
You'd like us at 6 million, even better, Beth.
No, I can wait for 6 million. So thank you all.